The military records facility hummed with quiet routine until Staff Sergeant Murphy's inventory report raised questions about missing documentation. "Run another verification check, Records Supervisor Martinez," he commanded, doubt clear in his voice about the accuracy. The unremarkable woman in standard civilian clothes worked silently near the storage units when her jacket pocket caught on a filing cabinet and one item that changed everything fell to the concrete floor. The effect was immediate. The records clerk's clipboard clattered beside it. Senior personnel froze at their workstations and faces drained of color throughout the facility. No one had expected to see the Medal of Honor fall from her pocket. No one had expected the quiet woman cataloging fallen soldiers to carry the nation's highest military decoration. No one had expected the truth. From which city in the world are you watching this video today? If this story captivated you, please consider subscribing. We share powerful stories of unsung heroes every week. The military records facility operated with the steady rhythm of administrative precision and hushed conversations. Rows of filing cabinets cast long shadows across focused workers, illuminating computer screens dotted with personnel files and casualty reports. The air carried the scent of old paper and archival preservation chemicals, mixed with the solemnity that came with handling the records of the fallen. It was 0900 hours on what had begun as a standard morning shift at Military Personnel Records Center Bravo 3, located within the secured compound at Arlington National Cemetery. Records Specialist 3rd Class Margaret Stone sat at her assigned cataloging station, deliberately unremarkable in her standard gray civilian work clothes and basic identification badge. Her auburn hair was pulled back in a practical ponytail, no visible decoration except for a simple government employee lanyard. Mid-40s, with a thoughtful face that spoke of careful attention to detail rather than military bearing. Her hazel eyes moved constantly between dog tag inventories and database entries, while her presence demanded nothing from the quiet efficiency around her. To a casual observer, she might have been any contractor, a longtime civilian employee perhaps, or another face in the endless rotation of records personnel. She occasionally made notes on a standard inventory form, her handwriting small and precise. Unlike the military personnel and senior staff who filled the facility with their service credentials and administrative authority, she wore no visible markers of military service or specialized clearance. Just a clerk, it seemed, with basic access and an assignment to verify routine casualty documentation. The current project involved digitizing historical records from recent conflicts for archival preservation purposes. The process had proceeded through standard phases: initial sorting, verification procedures, and now final cataloging before electronic storage. Records Supervisor Williams, a veteran administrator with something to prove, managed the digitization protocols with practiced efficiency, moving between workstations and checking progress reports throughout the records floor. The casualty documentation had established processing parameters that required careful verification, Williams explained to the facility director, his voice carrying across the archive bay. The decision to accelerate the digitization timeline created complications for standard quality control procedures. Director Harrison sat focused at the administrative console, his face a careful mask. A distinguished facility director with 25 years of military records experience, he looked somehow burdened in his business suit, as if the weight of managing fallen soldiers' legacies had physically aged him over recent years. Margaret watched it all, her expression revealing nothing. Only the occasional pause while handling certain dog tags suggested any emotional response to the solemn work. When the facility director called for a progress update, heads turned in mild surprise as Margaret raised her hand slightly from her position at the cataloging station. Specialist Stone has been conducting final verification procedures, Records Supervisor Williams announced. She may have additional assessment of processing accuracy. She moved toward the main administrative area with a deliberate precision that seemed at odds with her. Civilian clerk role. Something about her bearing, spine straight, steps measured, attention focused, caught the notice of a distinguished master sergeant seated near the main database terminals. He frowned slightly, studying her with newfound interest. Director Harrison, sharp-eyed and methodical, watched her with narrowed attention as she prepared her progress assessment. The director was known for his no-nonsense approach to records management and archival protocols. Today, he wore his authority like a burden, his suit pressed despite the early morning hour. Please state your verification findings for the record, instructed Director Harrison. Records Specialist 3rd Class Margaret Stone, Casualty Documentation Specialist, she replied. Her voice was soft but clear, her professional bearing perfect. Records Supervisor Williams began his questioning, and Margaret's responses were factual and precise, but delivered in such a measured, quiet tone that Director Harrison soon grew visibly impatient. Several times, the administrative recorder had to ask her to repeat her statements. Specialist Stone, Director Harrison finally interrupted. The entire administrative team needs to hear your verification assessment clearly. Please speak up. Yes, Director, Margaret responded, barely raising her volume. Records Supervisor Williams continued. Specialist Stone, can you explain your assessment of the documentation accuracy status? I've been conducting standard verification procedures and monitoring record integrity according to established archival protocols, she replied, her voice still frustratingly soft. I've identified several factors that affect documentation completeness based on current processing parameters. And what were your findings during verification procedures? I determined that casualty records respond normally to standard archival testing. I also noted significant pattern discrepancies that indicate potential authentication considerations. Did you document these observations? Yes, I logged all record anomalies and attempted accuracy analysis through available archival specifications. Was this analysis reviewed by administrative management? It was not forwarded beyond my immediate records supervisor. The facility security officer, Captain Lisa Rodriguez, approached for additional questioning with a skeptical demeanor. Tall and professional, with silver-streaked hair that lent her an air of authority, she moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to challenging questionable documentation assessments. Specialist Stone, what specific archival training qualifies you to analyze military casualty record authentication? I completed basic records verification during my government documentation certification program. And what level of military experience? Her tone suggested the answer would confirm Stone's limitations. I maintain appropriate experience levels for civilian records management work, Margaret responded evenly. Captain Rodriguez smiled thinly. Specialist Stone, how could you possibly understand the complexities of military casualty documentation and authentication protocols when you've been working here for only 10 weeks? Something flickered across Director Harrison's face. A brief shadow of recognition quickly suppressed. He studied Margaret more intently now. Objection to characterization, Records Supervisor Williams called out. Specialist Stone's verification assessments should be evaluated on merit. Sustained, Director Harrison replied, his eyes never leaving Margaret. Captain Rodriguez adjusted her approach. Let me rephrase. What specific experience do you have with military casualty records and combat documentation environments? Margaret paused before answering, her eyes briefly meeting those of the distinguished Master Sergeant near the database terminals. My background includes some practical application of records authentication analysis, she said carefully. Could you be more specific? That information involves previous assignments that may not be relevant to current verification requirements. Captain Rodriguez looked to the facility director. Director, if the specialist lacks relevant experience with military records, her authentication assessments should be considered accordingly. I'll allow the line of questioning, Director Harrison ruled. Specialist Stone, please provide more detail about your relevant experience. Margaret's expression remained neutral. My previous records experience involves classified military programs. How convenient, Captain Rodriguez remarked dryly. So we're expected to trust your authentication assessments without knowing your actual qualifications to evaluate military casualty documentation? I'm reporting on verification observations I made using established archival protocols. As the questioning continued, Margaret responded with increasingly precise details about military documentation, authentication procedures, and records protocols that made several senior staff members in the facility exchange glances. She referenced specific casualty reporting systems, verification methods, and documentation standards that seemed beyond the knowledge base of a standard records clerk. When shown historical casualty documents, her eyes lingered on them a moment longer than necessary, her composure wavering almost imperceptibly before returning to professional detachment. Do you recognize these documentation protocols, Specialist Stone? Captain Rodriguez asked. Yes, they represent the casualty records I've been verifying for archival processing. And your analysis of these protocols proved to be, what exactly? The verification observations you made about documentation authenticity, how does that affect current processing? Margaret's voice remained steady. The records analysis I conducted indicated casualty documentation that wasn't reflected in current authentication evaluations. My observations about verification standards were documented in my processing reports. In the records facility, the older master sergeant with multiple service ribbons watched Margaret with growing intensity, his brow furrowed in concentration as if trying to place a half-remembered face from military ceremonies. The morning hours passed as Records Supervisor Williams returned for follow-up questions, asking Margaret about specific verification requirements for the current project. Can you explain the standard protocols for authenticating military casualty documentation of this nature? Williams asked. The administrative team would have established primary and secondary verification procedures with authentication oversight, she explained, her voice still frustratingly soft. Standard protocol requires verified documentation accuracy and clearance confirmation at predetermined security levels. And if those procedures were insufficient or compromised, the backup verification would proceed using alternative authentication methods after primary processing was evaluated, utilizing specialized documentation protocols on confirmed casualty records, she explained with a level of technical precision that raised eyebrows among the administrative staff present. Director Harrison leaned forward, his patience visibly wearing thin. Specialist Stone, I've asked you repeatedly to speak up. This records facility cannot properly evaluate verification assessments. It cannot hear clearly. I apologize, Director, Margaret replied, her volume barely increasing. The older master sergeant in the facility now sat forward at his monitoring station, his eyes never leaving Margaret's face. Recognition seemed to be dawning slowly, his expression shifting from curiosity to something closer to alarm. Captain Rodriguez seized on the director's frustration. Perhaps Specialist Stone's reluctance to speak clearly reflects her limited confidence in her own verification assessments. Records Supervisor Williams stood immediately. Ma'am, that's inappropriate speculation. Noted, Williams, Director Harrison replied sharply. Captain Rodriguez, confine your remarks to relevant questions for the specialist. Captain Rodriguez nodded in acknowledgement. Specialist Stone, in your assessment as a records professional, was there anything about the casualty documentation that indicated modified authentication requirements? Margaret looked directly at the main database display for the first time. The verification assessment suggested authentication modifications beyond current protocol estimates. That wasn't my question. Based on what you observed, should authentication procedures have been modified? Based on the documentation patterns I identified, yes. But my assessment was not included in processing planning. Captain Rodriguez's expression hardened. Are you suggesting that verification information was deliberately ignored by administrative management? I'm stating that the records analysis I provided differed significantly from the authentication assessment that was distributed to processing personnel. The records facility stirred with murmurs. Director Harrison tapped his pen once against his desk, restoring order. Specialist Stone, Director Harrison said, his voice tight with growing impatience. You'll need to explain that assertion clearly and audibly for the administrative staff. What specifically was different about your analysis? Margaret paused, her eyes scanning the records facility briefly before returning to the director. When she spoke, her voice remained soft, forcing everyone to lean forward to hear. My records analysis indicated that the casualty documentation included authentication markers using verification protocols normally reserved for Medal of Honor recipients. That information was not included in the processing briefing provided to administrative personnel. Director Harrison's head snapped up, his carefully maintained composure cracking for the first time. The distinguished Master Sergeant's expression darkened as he studied Margaret with new intensity. Specialist Stone, Director Harrison said firmly, frustration evident in his tone. This is the final time I will ask you to speak louder. The entire administrative staff must be able to hear verification assessments accurately. Margaret looked directly at Director Harrison. A look of quiet recognition passed between them, though the director quickly masked it with professional detachment. The veteran master sergeant in the facility was now gripping his monitoring station, his knuckles white. Director Harrison finally interrupted with visible impatience, leaning forward at his administrative console. Specialist Stone, we don't have all morning. Speak clearly or we'll proceed with processing without additional verification input. The records facility fell silent. For the first time since beginning her assessment, Margaret looked directly at Director Harrison. A look of quiet recognition passed between them, though the director quickly masked it. The distinguished master sergeant near the database display leaned forward, his hands gripping his monitoring station. Suddenly, as Margaret turned to retrieve another file, her jacket pocket caught on the corner of a filing cabinet. The fabric tore slightly, and a small velvet case tumbled out, hitting the concrete floor with a distinctive metallic sound. The case opened on impact, revealing the distinctive blue ribbon and gold star of the Medal of Honor. The effect was immediate and electric. Director Harrison's pen fell from his fingers, clattering loudly on his desk. Several administrative staff physically straightened at their workstations, as if witnessing something impossible. Captain Rodriguez's face drained of color. The distinguished master sergeant near the database display stood up involuntarily, then slowly came to attention. Complete silence fell over the records facility as recognition dawned across various faces. Some looked confused, others shocked, and a few, those who understood the significance of what they had just witnessed, appeared stricken. Margaret continued in her normal soft voice, but now everyone was straining to hear. That medal was awarded to me because I was the platoon sergeant who held Firebase Charlie against overwhelming odds for 72 hours while calling in coordinates on my own position. I was also the senior NCO attached to the 3rd Infantry Division, which Director Harrison personally commanded during the Battle of Kost 3 years before today's processing began. She methodically produced a worn, waterproof document folder from her work bag and held it up for the administrative staff to see. This contains classified operational records from Firebase Charlie, not the sanitized reports filed with casualty processing. These documentation protocols aren't just archival procedures. They're based on authentication systems I helped develop before my medical retirement, and my service record was officially sealed. Director Harrison attempted to call for order, but found his voice failing him. Specialist Stone, this is highly irregular procedure for records assessment. My platoon and I were declared casualties during the Firebase Charlie action, Margaret continued calmly. I was the only survivor. I've spent 3 years working under civilian status and waiting for the proper time to ensure fallen soldiers' records receive the authentication they deserve, not for personal reasons, but to prevent other families from being denied closure because of compromised documentation protocols. A younger administrative technician near the database terminals looked up in confusion. This is impossible. Sergeant Major Stone was reported killed in action at Firebase Charlie. I processed posthumous award documentation myself. The distinguished master sergeant turned to address him. Remain at your station, specialist, he said quietly. Look at that medal. The Medal of Honor isn't issued to deceased personnel for administrative convenience. Margaret opened her document folder to reveal operational reports, casualty documentation, and classified records. My platoon was abandoned because someone in the chain of command was falsifying casualty reports to cover equipment losses and operational failures. The same system that provided false documentation leading to my unit's destruction and improper casualty reporting for dozens of fallen soldiers. The records facility erupted into controlled chaos. Director Harrison tapped his pen repeatedly on his desk, finally restoring some semblance of order. His face had lost all color, and his hand trembled visibly. This records facility will pause current operations for 30 minutes, he declared, his voice unsteady. But before anyone could move, Margaret spoke again. With respect, Director, this documentation system contains the same authentication failures that left families without proper closure for their fallen soldiers. I've waited 3 years to speak. But current processing is proceeding with compromised protocols that could dishonor the memory of those who gave everything. Director Harrison slowly leaned back in his chair, his authority visibly shaken. He nodded once, a gesture of reluctant permission. Firebase Charlie was classified above top secret, Margaret continued. Our mission was to hold strategic high ground that controlled supply routes for an entire region. We maintained that position against overwhelming enemy assault while calling artillery strikes on our own coordinates to prevent enemy breakthrough. What we discovered during the action was that our resupply had been redirected, our casualty evacuation was canceled, and our operational reports were being falsified to hide command failures. She turned her document folder and removed a sealed evidence packet. This contains operational logs, casualty reports, and authentication documentation. We transmitted accurate casualty data before the final assault. Those transmissions were received, but the accurate reports were suppressed while false documentation was filed with families and official records. Captain Rodriguez stood, her voice hollow. I received direct notification that Firebase Charlie had been overrun with total casualties. The action reports were filed accordingly with casualty assistance. We held that position, Margaret said simply. We were very much alive and requesting immediate medical evacuation for our wounded. I heard command acknowledge our casualty reports, then watched as different documentation was processed for official notification. Records Supervisor Williams approached Margaret cautiously. Sergeant Major Stone, if what you're saying is true, how did you survive? And why assume civilian status for 3 years? Margaret's composure never wavered as the facility remained suspended in shocked recognition. I survived because I refused to abandon my wounded soldiers during the final evacuation attempt. I was critically wounded, unconscious, presumed dead along with my platoon. Local medical personnel found me and kept me alive while I recovered. By the time I was functional again, the official story was established. My unit was dead, the firebase had fallen, and the command responsible had been transferred to administrative positions. She looked around the records facility, meeting the eyes of several senior staff members. I needed time to gather evidence that couldn't be easily buried again. I needed to understand who was responsible for the false casualty reports and who was simply processing compromised documentation. Most importantly, I needed to make sure no other families would suffer because of the same authentication failures that dishonored my soldiers' sacrifice. The distinguished Master Sergeant approached the central administrative area. Director, request permission to address the administrative staff. I am Master Sergeant James Mitchell, First Sergeant retired. I was the company First Sergeant when Sergeant Major Stone held Firebase Charlie. He turned to face Margaret. Sergeant Major Stone was the finest NCO I ever served with. If she says casualty reports were falsified, I believe her without question. Captain Rodriguez interjected. This is all highly dramatic, but it has no direct bearing on current records processing. Documentation digitization proceeds according to established archival protocols, not some conspiracy from years ago. They're connected, Margaret replied as the Medal of Honor gleamed on the floor between them. The authentication systems being used here include the same documentation vulnerabilities from Firebase Charlie that allowed false casualty reports. Current processing is proceeding with compromised specifications. History repeating itself. Different facility, same failures, same source. She pulled another document from her folder. This is a casualty summary showing that my platoon reported accurate casualty information directly to Regional Command 6 times during the Firebase Charlie action. We were told explicitly that questioning casualty procedures would compromise operational security. We weren't being insubordinate. We were trying to ensure accurate documentation for fallen soldiers' families. Director Harrison studied the document, his administrative leadership demeanor cracking further. These casualty reports weren't included in the documentation briefing I received for today's processing evaluation. Because they were deliberately removed, Margaret said, just like current authentication assessments are being modified to hide ongoing documentation failures. And just like the evidence was suppressed from Firebase Charlie after my unit was reported killed in action, the records facility had grown absolutely still despite the continuing administrative operations. Every person present was aware they were witnessing something extraordinary. Even the database technicians had stopped their routine processing, staring at Margaret with undisguised astonishment. Records Supervisor Williams approached the administrative console. Director, in light of this new intelligence, I recommend immediate review of casualty documentation authentication and potentially suspending current processing pending accuracy assessment. Director Harrison nodded absently, his attention still fixed on Margaret as the facility remained in suspended operation. Granted, all records processing will implement enhanced authentication protocols immediately. He paused, then added, Sergeant Major Stone will remain under protective status until these matters are resolved. As staff began coordinating the operational changes, Margaret spoke again. There's something else you should know, Director. She removed a final document from her folder. This is the original authorization for Firebase Charlie operations with your signature from when you served as battalion commander. And this, she produced another paper, is the casualty report that dishonored my soldiers. The reporting signatures don't match. Director Harrison took both documents with trembling hands. Someone forged my signature on the casualty documentation, he whispered, shock evident in his voice. Yes, Margaret confirmed. You've been carrying responsibility for documentation failures you never authorized. The false casualty reports came directly from regional command offices. The retired Master Sergeant Mitchell moved closer. I always questioned why accurate casualty reporting would be suppressed, Harrison. It didn't align with anything I knew about your respect for fallen soldiers. Director Harrison looked up, visible emotion crossing his face. I've spent 3 years believing I was responsible for documentation that dishonored soldiers' sacrifice and denied families proper closure. I authorized the operational support, but I never authorized falsifying casualty reports for administrative convenience. The facility communications crackled, and a team of military investigators appeared at the main entrance, led by a stern-faced senior officer. What is the meaning of this administrative suspension? The officer demanded through the intercom. Director Harrison, I'm Colonel Patricia Foster from the Inspector General's office. We received an anonymous documentation package yesterday containing evidence of serious breaches of casualty reporting protocols involving falsified records and family notification failures. I understand there may be connected evidence being reported in this facility. Margaret smiled faintly as the Medal of Honor caught the facility lighting. Right on schedule, she murmured. Colonel Foster's voice came through the intercom. You would be Sergeant Major Stone, formerly of Firebase Charlie. I would be. We have extensive questions for you, Sergeant Major, starting with how you survived and why you assumed civilian status. And I have answers, Colonel Foster. 3 years' worth. The officer's voice continued through the facility communications. Director Harrison, with your permission, I'd like to take custody of the evidence Sergeant Major Stone has provided and arrange for her protection pending a full investigation. Director Harrison nodded toward the intercom. Granted, but I want to be kept fully informed of any evidence relating to current documentation authenticity and potential casualty reporting compromise. Of course, Director. It appears several ongoing processing operations have been compromised by the same source. The records facility began to clear of non-essential personnel as security protocols allowed, but Captain Rodriguez remained at her monitoring station, looking shell-shocked. Margaret approached her quietly while the facility remained in partial suspension. I don't understand, Rodriguez said, looking up at her. Why would you risk exposure? I'm the one who processed the false casualty reports that dishonored your soldier's memory. Because you were another victim of the same documentation compromise, Margaret replied simply. You processed what you believed were accurate reports from trusted sources. The responsibility rests with those who provided false information, not those who were deceived by it. How can you be so certain I wasn't involved? Margaret allowed herself the smallest of smiles, glancing toward the Medal of Honor still gleaming on the floor. Because I've spent 3 years studying every detail of what happened. I know who falsified the casualty reports and why. I know who altered documentation and who benefited from the cover-up. Most importantly, I know you requested verification twice because you suspected something was wrong with the casualty information. Captain Rodriguez's eyes widened. How could you possibly know that? Those communications were classified. I had help, Margaret admitted. Not everyone in military records was compromised. There are still good people within the system who wanted the truth to come out, and who wanted to ensure fallen soldiers receive the honor and recognition they earned. As she prepared to leave with Colonel Foster's team, the veteran Master Sergeant Mitchell approached as security protocols began to normalize. Sergeant Major, he said formally, then dropped his voice. Margaret, we held a memorial service for the Firebase Charlie unit. I spoke about your leadership under impossible odds. I know, she replied quietly. I read the citation online. Thank you for honoring their sacrifice properly. What happens to this records processing now? Margaret looked at the database displays showing current facility operations. Now it proceeds with honest authentication assessment and proper verification protocols. Fallen soldiers can be honored accurately because someone finally told the truth about documentation failures. The records facility remains suspended in a moment of profound revelation as administrative systems gradually return to normal. Director Harrison slowly stood from his administrative console and removed his facility credentials, setting them on his desk before stepping down to stand on the same level as Margaret. This facility recognizes Sergeant Major Margaret Stone, Medal of Honor recipient. He announced formally, his voice carrying a weight of regret and respect. The retired Master Sergeant Mitchell approached Margaret and rendered a respectful salute. Others throughout the records facility followed suit, a ripple of silent recognition spreading through the room. Administrative personnel who had moments ago regarded her with skepticism now stood at attention, honoring a soldier whose courage had protected them all. Captain Rodriguez, visibly shaken, stood to address Margaret directly. I never knew who provided those casualty reports. I've been processing documentation for 3 years, believing I was serving families with accurate information. I know, Margaret replied. Your questions about the documentation that day, I saw them in the processing logs. You tried to verify the information. Multiple times, Rodriguez confirmed, her voice breaking slightly. They told me I was risking operational security by questioning administrative procedures, that the casualty authentication had been verified through other channels. Director Harrison's professional demeanor cracked as he turned to face the administrative staff. I authorized Firebase Charlie operational support based on casualty reporting protocols that indicated proper family notification procedures. I did not authorize the false documentation that dishonored those soldiers. The signatures were forged. You've been living with responsibility that was never yours to bear, Margaret confirmed. Regional Command used your administrative authority to cover their own casualty reporting failures. Colonel Foster's team finally gained entry as security protocols normalized. Director Harrison, I'd like to request a formal suspension of current records processing while we secure this evidence and establish proper protocols for what happens next. This has implications for multiple ongoing documentation projects and potentially hundreds of casualty records. Director Harrison nodded. Current operations will continue with enhanced authentication protocols, but all casualty documentation will be immediately reviewed for potential falsification. He paused. Captain Rodriguez, in light of the evidence presented, you are relieved of any responsibility for the Firebase Charlie incident pending complete review of the circumstances. As military investigators began securing the records facility and escorting people to debriefing areas, Margaret opened her document folder and carefully displayed photographs showing Regional Command personnel meeting with contractors who profited from equipment loss cover-ups and casualty report manipulation. This was never about recognition, she said softly, addressing the facility at large. It was about ensuring fallen soldiers receive accurate documentation and their families receive honest closure, and about making sure military records serve the memory of those who sacrificed everything rather than the convenience of those who failed them. As she moved toward the administrative exit, her shadow stretched long behind her across the facility floor, the shadow of a sergeant major standing at attention rather than a records specialist checking documentation. For a moment, she paused to look back at the database displays showing current processing operations. The administrative staff was coordinating with proper authentication information for the first time in years. Director Harrison was directing operations with restored confidence in documentation accuracy. Captain Rodriguez was working to identify other potentially compromised casualty records. Master Sergeant Mitchell watched her from near the administrative console, his face reflecting a complex mix of pride and determination. Margaret gave him a small nod before continuing toward the exit with Colonel Foster's team. Her mission wasn't quite complete. There would be extensive debriefings, military investigations, and probably congressional oversight. The full scope of the documentation falsification would need to be exposed, and those responsible held accountable at every level. But the most important part was accomplished. The truth was out, and fallen soldiers could once again trust that their records would honor their sacrifice accurately rather than serve administrative convenience. As she reached the records facility exit, a military police escort approached. Sergeant Major Stone, Colonel Foster has arranged secure transportation for your continued protection. If you'll come this way. She followed the escort toward the exit, conscious of the eyes following her progress. Administrative staff, database personnel, security officers. For 3 years, she had lived invisibly, unremarkable and unnoticed, gathering evidence while pretending to be a routine clerk. Now she walked openly, her service recognized, her purpose fulfilled. The older veteran caught up with her just before she reached the exit corridor. "Sergeant Major," he said quietly, "what you did, surviving, maintaining your cover, gathering evidence, coming forward at the right moment. It was extraordinary courage. I had a duty to my soldiers and to the families who came after them," she replied simply. "It was more than duty," he insisted. "It was leadership of the highest order and service that honored every fallen soldier." Margaret allowed herself a small smile. "You taught us well, Master Sergeant Mitchell." "I taught you procedures and protocols," he corrected. "What you demonstrated today, that came from the heart." He watched her leave with the investigative team, then turned to Director Harrison, who had joined them. "Some heroes never get the recognition they deserve in their lifetime," he said quietly. "They just carry the weight of honoring others." Director Harrison nodded, watching Margaret's figure disappear down the corridor. And some truths are worth waiting years to tell. The morning light continued to strengthen as Margaret's escort vehicle pulled away from Military Personnel Records Center Bravo 3. Behind her, the facility buzzed with renewed purpose as records operations moved forward with proper authentication protocols and accurate casualty documentation procedures. The administrative staff worked with restored confidence, knowing their processing would honor fallen soldiers accurately. Ahead lay the challenge of ensuring complete justice was served and that the full scope of the documentation falsification network was exposed and dismantled. But for now, in this moment between what was hidden and what would be revealed, the simple act of truth had transformed a routine records assessment into something profound. The power of one soldier's quiet determination to honor fallen comrades and protect military families, even when it meant sacrificing years of her recognition to gather the evidence necessary to expose betrayal that powerful forces had tried to maintain forever. As her vehicle reached the main gate, Margaret's radio crackled with an update from the records facility. All authentication protocols have been restored to maximum verification standards. Investigation proceeding with full Inspector General oversight. Margaret closed her eyes and smiled for the first time in 3 years, knowing that this time, fallen soldiers would be honored with accurate documentation rather than compromised by administrative convenience.